It's time to take a new approach to finding true fulfillment in your career, health, and state of mind through insightful conversations with those who have found their professional and personal passions while achieving balance. Whether it's entrepreneurs, athletes, or healthcare professionals, we bring you real people, real growth right here on the Boost Podcast. Now, here's your host, Elena Lipson.
Hey Boost Squad, and welcome to episode 27. Elena Lipson here, and I am honored to introduce today's featured guest, Josh Linkner. Josh, are you ready to join the Boost Squad?
Absolutely.
So before we dive into today's episode, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Mosaic Growth Partners. Mosaic Growth Partners provides growth strategy consulting to entrepreneurs and organizations in the healthcare and older adult baby boomer market. They can help you bring a new product or service to market, identify and engage new customers and partners, or grow your market share. They also provide coaching and training. For more information, go to mosaicgrowth.com. That's mosaicgrowth.com. Now back to today's featured guest.
So Josh has spent his career harnessing the power of creative disruption. His journey has been non-traditional at every step. As the founder and CEO of 5 tech companies, Josh built his businesses from a blank page into a combined value of over $200 million. As a hyper-growth CEO of over 20 years, he's used innovative approaches to topple competitors, fight through adversity, and achieve at the highest levels. In addition to his own startups, Josh has been involved with the launch, growth, or financing of over 100 other companies. He's helped raise over $150 million of venture capital and has mentored leaders and entrepreneurs through the struggles of explosive growth. He is the founding partner of Detroit Venture Partners, which invests in tech startups as a platform to help rebuild his beloved hometown of Detroit, Michigan. He's also the founder and CEO of ePrize, where Josh built the largest digital promotions agency in the world, serving 74 of the top 100 brands. Working with many of the most progressive CMOs in the world, he's a pioneer in digital marketing, winning dozens of awards for groundbreaking innovation at the intersection of technology and advertising. Josh is also an internationally recognized thought leader and a top-rated keynote speaker on innovation, creativity, reinvention, and hyper-growth leadership. His keynotes are focused not only on inspiring audiences, but also sharing actionable strategies to drive meaningful outcomes. He's also a 2-time New York Times bestselling author of 3 books, which you can find on the show notes in our website. He's a weekly contributor to Inc. magazine, Forbes, and the Detroit Free Press, and a professional jazz guitarist. He has twice been named the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year and is a President Obama Champion of Change Award recipient. So there's obviously so much to get into here with you today, Josh. So I want to start first by knowing, what are the 3 things that we should know about creative disruption?
Well, thanks again, and such a pleasure to be here with you today. The word creative disruption it can feel scary and a bit overwhelming, but I would argue that it's more scary to stand still. Too often we overestimate the risk of trying something new and underestimate the risk of the status quo. And what we know today is that we're living in a world of constant change. In fact, a rate of change like none other in history. So I believe it's incumbent on us, no matter what our jobs are or our role inside of an organization, to make sure that we are that source of disruption rather than having it thrust upon us. You asked the question, what are the 3 things that we can think about? One is that this isn't within the grasp of each of us. Innovation, these are big, scary words, but it doesn't have to be. I'd like the listeners to think about the notion of everyday innovation or everyday disruption. In other words, you don't have to come up with the entire industry-changing event. You can disrupt the way you run your Monday morning meeting, or the way that you greet a customer, or the way that you cold call, or the way that you run a production line. So these aren't the things that make the cover of a magazine, but they have massive impact in our lives, and they become much more accessible when you start thinking about disrupting the little stuff instead of only the big things. Second thing I would say is that this type of thinking, these type of solutions, we're hardwired for it as human beings. Perhaps many of us don't feel creative. We weren't very good in art in Mrs. Johnson's 3rd grade class. But the truth is that all of us as human beings have enormous creative capacity, and the research is crystal clear on this. So even if you weren't good at playing an instrument or drawing or painting, doesn't mean you can't be creative in your work, whatever your role may be. So if you're in the legal department or you're in the finance department or a department that you wouldn't ordinarily think of as a quote unquote creative department, doesn't mean you can't apply creativity. In fact, you may find all kinds of cool, innovative solutions to your most pressing challenges. So the point number 2 here is that it is accessible to us all, and that all of us as humans have the innate skill to disrupt and to be creative. The third thing I would say is that very often we do things out of patterns. The mind is very good at pattern recognition. And you learn as a kid, you have to touch the hot stove and it's hot and you don't touch it again. But the world that we live in is much more fluid than that. It'd be the equivalent of that stove one day being hot and the next day printing $1 million. So because it's changing so much, we can fall into a trap of doing things the way we've always done them. And because we're so good at pattern recognition, we tend to make our decisions, little and big, based on what worked or what didn't work in the past. Instead, though, I would recommend that we really look to defy those traditions. Look those traditions square in the eye and ask ourselves, is there a better way? What would happen if I flipped it upside down? What would happen if I took a different, alternative, unorthodox approach? And we may come to a conclusion that something we're doing is still optimal, so don't change it for the sake of it. If it's still the best approach, keep it. On the other hand, by asking the question, by looking at those assumptions and traditions, gives us an opportunity to express a little creativity and perhaps find a better way forward, ultimately driving an improvement in results.
Yes, I love that. So think about the little things that you can disrupt every day. We all have some innate ability to be creative in us, and don't fall into your habits. Kind of get out of your everyday rut and think about the little things that you can disrupt. And I want to really follow up on that second one where you said, you might not have been creative in your art class back in elementary school. So I am a product of public schools and I was never good at art. And so I never really was thought of as a creative person. So what if you've been kind of gone through your whole education, you get out of school, you've never been trained to think that you are creative, which I think being creative is a lot of in your head of believing that you can be. What are some ways that you can unlock that creativity if it's been kind of laying dormant for a long time?
Well, you're so right. I mean, think about what we were taught in school. You were taught to follow the rules, and guess what the teacher knows? And there's only one right answer. Whatever you do, don't make any mistakes. But if you run that game plan in the real world, it's a surefire path to mediocrity. So what we need to do is, first of all, acknowledge that we have the capacity to be creative, no matter what our teachers told us. And Harvard actually ran a study. They asked the age-old question, is creativity born or is it developed? Is it nature or nurture? And what they found is remarkable. What they found is that creativity is actually 85% learned behavior, which means even on our groggiest days, each of us has at least 85% the creative capacity as Mozart or Da Vinci or Picasso. The way you've got to look at it, though, is that it's like a language. It's a skill. It's a learned skill. And like any skill, it requires practice. So even if you had a capacity to play tennis, but you never practiced, you wouldn't be very good. On the other hand, if you practice tennis regularly, you would improve. Same exact thing. And a good way to think of it is like you're building your creativity muscles. So the more that we allow ourselves the permission to make some mistakes, the permission to express some creativity, to explore the defiant routes, the unorthodox routes, what happens is that we start to reconnect to the natural abilities that we have to be creative. Like I said, the good news is the way we're built is we're built for this. We're creative by design. We've been trained out of it, but we can reconnect to those abilities very quickly. So the way to do it is practice. There's lots of fun techniques. I mean, I'll just share one of them real briefly with you. My favorite brainstorming technique of all. So we've all done brainstorming. Problem with brainstorming is that it's a perfect system to come up with mediocre ideas. Reason is fear. Turns out the biggest blocker of creative thinking is fear, not natural talent, fear. Fear is that poisonous force that robs us of our most creative ideas. So if you're in a traditional brainstorming meeting, you share your safe ideas, but you hold your crazy ones back because you don't want to look foolish and you don't want to offend anyone and you don't want to say the wrong thing. Now, if we want to get really creative, here's what we do. It's a technique called role storming. Role storming. Role storming is brainstorming in character. So what you do is you take on an actual problem, same problem you're going to tackle anyway, but now pretend that you're somebody else. So if you were playing the role, for example, of Steve Jobs, no one's going to laugh at Steve for coming up with a crazy idea. They might laugh at Steve for coming up with a small idea. So now you, aka Steve, are totally liberated. You can say anything you want, no fear at all of retribution. So the approach is very simple. Take on an actual real challenge and pretend that you are anyone you want. You could be an inventor, you could be a literary figure, you could be a sports hero, you could be a villain, and actually try to solve the problem as if you were somebody else. And what that does is it completely shatters the fear and allows you to become liberated and share your most provocative ideas.
I love that. And I have never seen that in any of the corporate environments that I've been in, or even with some of the startups that I work with. Are you seeing this happen more and more in companies?
Yeah, I did it in my own company and it allowed us to win many times. But funny example, I did this with a group of executives at Sony Japan. I met this guy. He was like the stiffest human being I've ever met. We're talking dark suit, white shirt, ties. This guy was stiff as a board. Anyway, we got him role storming as Yoda. And I have never seen personal transformation like this. This guy's jacket's off, his tie's undone. He's leaping around the room, and the whiteboards were filled with ideas. The thing is, I didn't teach him to be creative. He had that inside him all along, as do all of us. But the role he was in, society-wise, forbid it. Put him in a new role, and he was able to really share those most compelling ideas.
Great. I love that example. So you just recently came out with a new book on hacking innovation. And I want to hear a little bit about this and how you think this is really part of the future of innovation versus where innovation has traditionally been.
Yeah, so in writing my new book, I looked for a new source of inspiration, and it led me to hackers. Now, hackers, of course, are our biggest threat to national security. It's a very scary topic. But if you pull their motives aside for a second, it's not so easy to hack into a bank. So I started looking at hacking as simply a tool set or a methodology to complex problem solving, which, yes, it can be used for bad, but also can be used for good, just like a knife could be used for harm or for healing. So I spent the last 3 years studying hackers. I spoke to criminals, law enforcement, cybersecurity professionals, and I tried to understand their mindsets and their tactics. Certainly not to teach or promote cybercrime, more to say, what could we learn? What if there was a hacker that turned the corner and became legitimate and was running a Fortune 500 company? How would they do it? And so it led me to an expanded definition of hackers. We think of hackers as notorious people wearing hoodies in a shady basement somewhere, but I think of hackers as people who are driving real change. And so, for example, I would argue that Martin Luther King was a hacker for social justice, or Henry Ford was a hacker in terms of his innovations on the assembly line. So in that context, the ones that really make history are hackers. So anyway, in the book, I really explored their mindsets and tactics and came up with 5 primary mindsets and 10 core tactics that hackers use that we can use in the legitimate world to drive profound gain, to make impact, to serve those in our communities.
Great. Can you share some of those tactics with us? Maybe 1 or 2 of them?
Sure, I'd love to. Well, just on the mindset front for a second, one of the mindset ones that I like the most, again, there's 5 core mindsets, is called compasses over maps. Compasses over maps. We are trained in the professional lives in a map-based world. In other words, we're very good at following directions. So if a boss gives you a very specific set of directions, you go follow them. That's what we're trained to do. Now, think about if you wanted to go, let's say I live in Detroit and I wanted to go to Miami. I could follow Google Maps and it would tell me exactly where to go, how to take every turn. I can turn my brain off. The problem is in our professional lives today, in the insane amount of speed, complexity, and competition that we have, there's no such thing as a map to success anymore. In fact, the map is constantly changing. It would be like if the roads shifted 6 times an hour. And so really what's incumbent on us if we want to win is we have to be able to move forward without all the answers. We have to make decisions in the face of ambiguity. We have to go ahead and course correct along the way, using our brains and our judgment and our creativity to guide us at each step of the journey. And so hackers tend to use compasses over maps. In other words, they set their desired outcome, but they don't have a specific game plan on how they're going to get there. And through a series of rapid experimentation and very quick tweaks and adaptations, they're able to ultimately carve their best route to the plan. And that's what we need to do in the business world. Instead of relying on a playbook or a set of rules and regulations, it's empowering ourselves and those around us to proceed and make those creative adjustments as we go.
Very.
One of the tactics you asked about, there's a number of different tactics, but one of my favorite is called the reverse, which is basically trying the polar opposite. So in other words, if you're a hacker and you're trying to, normally you would infiltrate through a password, maybe you infiltrate through physical grounds. It's doing the exact opposite of what everyone else would expect. So if you were a restaurant, instead of selling your food per item, maybe you'd sell a subscription service. And you can come many times you want per month as long as you pay the fee. So the idea is taking a look at what you're doing, taking a look at what everybody else is doing, and forcing yourself to consider the polar opposite. What's the exact complete 180-degree difference than what everyone else is doing? And it may lead you to a whole different train of thought, and in turn may lead you to a much more compelling solution.
Yeah, I like those examples a lot. And so you work both with startups and established companies. And I think there's a stereotype, at least, that startups are better at disruption and innovation than some of these established entities. And given some of the things, the role of the mindset of compasses and this tactic of reverse, I don't know that that's necessarily always true when you look at startups versus corporations and established organizations. What are your thoughts on whether one is innately more innovative than the other, and how you can apply these tactics to both types of organizations?
Yeah, great question. So startup thinking is like hacking thinking, is very important, but it doesn't necessarily tie to the size of your organization or your balance sheet. In other words, you can be a giant company and think small, think like a startup, or you could be a small company and think really clunky and bureaucratic. So the actual size has nothing to do with it. It's a mindset, and it's an approach and a philosophy. And I've seen very large corporations act in extremely nimble, progressive, fire in the belly, urgency kind of ways, and it absolutely can be done. Now, it takes a little bit more work because by definition, a company is big because it's enjoyed some success. Now, success is awesome, but there is an underbelly to it, in that it lures smart people into the wrong type of thinking. You start protecting old ideas instead of creating new ones. And so what we need to do as larger companies is think about how can we be that source of disruption rather than having it thrust upon us? How can we be the company that puts ourselves out of business? So to a degree, you often hear people say, oh, we don't want to cannibalize our core business. Probably heard that term.
Yep.
I think we need to do the opposite. In other words, be the cannibal. Be that source that comes in and proactively puts ourselves out of business rather than waiting for some either startup or existing competitor to do that to us. So again, I think we can embrace this type of thinking if we have the focus and the discipline and the permission to do so, even in a large organization.
Yep. So you've actually had a lot of success applying these tactics to your own career. You've done a lot of different things. Can you give us 3 specific tactics for how you've grown your businesses and your career to the point that you've gotten today?
Well, funny enough, a lot of them really map back to these tactics, in the book. One of the things that I've been pretty good at is letting go. Back to the big company question, that's one of the hardest things to do. So it's easy to let go of things that aren't working out. But letting go of success in favor of the possibilities takes more courage. One of the things that I like is this example from Louis C.K., who's one of my favorite comedians. Every year he throws away all of his old material. So even if he had standing ovations and sold out houses, you'll never see him do the same bits again. By starting with a blank page, it forces him to remain fresh and relevant and creative rather than becoming stale and complacent. So that planned obsolescence that he applies in this case, keeps his edge strong. And that's one of the things that I've always done. I've always been saying, all right, how can I put myself out of business? How can I replace the Josh of 6 months ago with a new version that's improved and different and has evolved? So I'm always making sure that I'm pushing the boundaries in terms of my own growth and evolution. So that's one thing that I've always done.
So how do you know when the right time is to kind of move on from that, other than thinking of like every 6 months? What's another indicator that would tell you it's time to kind of put yourself out of business and move on to the next idea?
My second book was called The Road to Reinvention. And it talks about reinvention not as an individual event, like once a decade, but as an ongoing process. So to a degree, I think that applies to us individually and as organizations, that we should always be in some form of reinvention. The way to do it in a less risky and less scary way is to isolate certain aspects. So for example, if you have a company, instead of trying to reinvent everything at once, you might keep everything the same, except only focus on customer experience and put a real reinvention effort around every touch point for your customers, delighting their 5 senses. Once you get that over the goal line, let's say it takes 6, 7, 8 months, then focus on something else. Maybe it's driving efficiencies. Then once that's really optimized, then you go on to the next thing. So the idea is an ongoing stream of isolated reinventions rather than a wholesale bet the farm crazy one big initiative. So in that context, to answer your question personally, I'm always trying to reinvent some little aspect. It could be my responsiveness or the way I'm learning and growing, the way I'm reading, the way I take care of myself physically. And again, it's much less scary and overwhelming if you think about it as always doing little reinventions rather than waiting for one big one.
Yep.
I think another thing that I've tried to do is to keep always kind of leaning forward into new trends. So it's very easy. Again, we become successful, which is great. It can be a real trap because we expect success to be a permanent condition, as if we've cracked the code and will be successful forever. And the one thing that time has taught us is that it's a temporary state in the context of many external factors that today are changing at an unprecedented rate. So what that means is that we need to basically think about riding one point of success, certainly celebrate the moment, but that's the jumping off point for the next one, to make sure that we are being our most innovative at those points of success rather than waiting for tragedy to strike and having to claw and scratch our way back from adversity. So what I've tried to do is, as I hit those different crests of success, yes, I celebrate the moment, but I'm always saying, all right, what's next? Is there new technology? Is there a new shift in demographics? There's a new market opportunity that I could build from one to the next, as opposed to waiting for the entire cycle to come and go before starting the next thing. It was always like pushing yourself forward and craving the new rather than relying on the past.
Yep.
The other thing that I've done personally, although I don't know that I recommend it to everyone, I have a pretty intense style. I'm always trying to get things done quickly. To me, time is the biggest enemy of us all. So we all have the same 24-hour clock that we're up against. So I try to always compress time, which is not an easy thing to do. But if you can get something done in one meeting instead of 4 meetings, how do you let's do that. If you can figure out a way to save cycles or to save minutes even, I try to be super protective of my time, which then allows me to essentially accomplish more in less amount of time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Can you give us one hack that has really saved you a lot of time?
Sure. I use a bunch of different hacks, but one of them is I schedule my drive time and commute time. So I'll either proactively use that time to like listen to a book on tape so I can learn from it, or I will schedule a phone call or a meeting or whatever else. But I try to use my in-transit time as opportunity as opposed to just like staring out the window and listening to music. Nothing wrong with that. Sometimes if you're doing it proactively, like you need to reset to recharge the batteries, great. But using that time as proactive time. So I just look for, it's very difficult for any of us to find huge blocks of time in our days. It's hard to say, oh, I'm going to take a 7-hour block of time and stare at the whiteboard. So I try to look at it as these little sprints, like, hey, if I've got 11 minutes, how can I make the most use of that? So I just try to really capitalize on each of those little opportunities of little windows of time.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. I do something similar. So I have a dog and she needs to go out for walks several times a day. And I use those times to really catch up on podcasts to learn as well. It's not a good time for me to talk on the phone to people because there's all sorts of like wind and it's just never a good connection. But I'm with you. I don't like to let like any minute go by where I'm not doing something productive. So that one makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like, you are very driven, extremely ambitious. You want to make every moment of your day productive, but no one's successful 24/7. So tell me about a time when you might have stagnated or stopped making progress and then how you got yourself back on track.
So I studied music in college, and a professor told me something kind of interesting. He basically said that the stuff that you're learning now, even if you can intellectualize it, doesn't really show up in your music for 6 months. There's like a latency period. So he called it the 6-month rule, where if I learned a new scale, for example, even though I could play the scale, it didn't really become part of my voice, my music, until 6 months later. I think there's also this latency period in our own growth and evolution. And what I found is that when I'm enjoying the most external success, that's the time you tend to let your foot off the gas and maybe not invest as much in your own growth or learning or drive or forward-looking stuff. You kind of coast a little bit, and then you have this crash 6 months later because the success you're enjoying now is probably as a result of the effort you put in 6 months prior. So knowing that there's like the 6-month latency period, even if I'm enjoying great monetary success or other types of successes, it's to say, okay, if I want to have that continue 6 months from now, I better be making the investments today.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you seem particularly disciplined. I'm sure most people, do get complacent at times and probably like maybe need more downtime than you because you seem like you're very high energy. You said you were intense, you're on the go a lot. So what are some ways that, you take that time for yourself in order to recharge and allow yourself to kind of absorb everything that's happened and also take care of yourself as well?
And thank you for saying that. And by the way, I'm not perfect. I have plenty of shortcomings along those lines as well. It's funny, I wasn't planning to talk about this, but back in my music school education, I rarely talk about this, by the way, so I'm glad we're having this chat, but I was really at a frustration point playing music. I was like at a wall. And my professor told me, he said, go feed the pigeons. And I thought he was joking. He's like, no, I'm not joking. Stop playing music. Go out there, sit on a park bench for 2 hours and feed the pigeons. And I was like, oh, this crazy old nut or whatever. But funny enough, his point was that if you're so focused on the work, you're so heads down, you actually lose perspective. And your art form, whatever your art may be, even if you're an accountant, that's still art, that it will suffer. So sometimes you're exactly right. You need to get away from it in order to improve it. So for me, I play music, obviously, and that's a wonderful source of inspiration for me. I spend time with my family, whom I adore and love. I love reading. For me, it's a personal thing. But I think the point is, whatever our individual muses may be, whether your muse is playing sports or working out or as long as it's not a counterproductive muse like smoking cigarettes or something, I think you pursue whatever muse you want because whatever it takes to re-energize you is terrific. And actually, your end work product will benefit by taking a little bit of time off to feed the pigeons.
Totally agree. So you strike me as someone that is probably always on. And I don't know you that well, so I could be wrong, but that's kind of how I see you. But how do you kind of turn yourself off when you're really used to being on all the time? How do you bring that energy level down a little bit?
It is hard. It is hard to do that. And especially because, I have peak intensity moments. So if I'm giving a keynote in front of 8,000 people, you walk up the stage, you just poured your heart and soul into something for 90 minutes. There is a little bit of that downtime crash. But I think a lot of it is acknowledging it and not judging it. So if you need to take time off and get a massage or just have a little quiet time or meditate or whatever's good for each individual person, you don't have to say, okay, well, I'm working out, I'm productive, and when I'm sitting there idle, I'm unproductive. I think we just need to remove judgment altogether and realize that one feeds the next and that there is sort of a cyclical nature to most things. And so having time to recharge our batteries can be one of the most productive things that we can do. There's all these studies recently about sleep and about how sleep is one of the most powerful things that we can really do. We think of it as like idle, wasteful, frivolous time, but actually, heals our body and our mind in a very big way. So I don't know that there's a silver bullet for any, it's a personal thing. What recharges one may not be recharging for the other, but I think it is important for each of us to take a little bit of that downtime and embrace it and celebrate it and not feel guilty that we're taking our eye off the ball.
Yeah, I love that. Don't feel guilty just because you want to sleep in a little bit on a Saturday. There's nothing wrong with that. So you've given us a lot of great wisdom today, from talking about disruption and innovation to some of your own hacks to save time and also to take care of yourself. But let's go ahead and close with a parting piece of guidance for all of us.
Well, I would say that the stakes have never been higher and the threats have never been greater. The competition has never been more fierce. But I really believe the opportunity has never been more profound. Today, we live in a world of instant information, incredible access. It's never been a better time to be in business, to be an entrepreneur, to be an artist or a creator. And so I think that if we can focus on those things, focus on not just replicating what others have done, but creating our own, I keep using the word art, but you could be an artist in terms of being an insurance agent or being an artist in terms of landscape. When I think about the art, it means how much value you're adding to your customers and value you're adding to the world. And there's never been a better time to be an artist of any type in any type of structure. And so I think if we focus on that, focus on injecting our creativity into the daily work, if we focus on changing the traditions and flipping them upside down and disrupting them a bit, if we focus on the possibilities instead of the past, that there's a really bright future for each of us. And I know it requires a little courage to muster up, but if you really look back, that's what we're here to do. We're here to make history. I think each of us has an opportunity to leave our fingerprints on the world. And the last thing we want to do is be 40 years later filled with regret. So now is the time to take those risks. Now is the time to express our creativity, to innovate, to pioneer, no matter what our field may be. And when we can do that, we can look ourselves in the mirror and saying, you know what, I'm proud of the difference that I was able to create.
Love that. So focus on creating your own art and the possibilities that you can bring to the world to add your value. So I hope today's episode inspires you to think more about how you can find your passion and live your best life. For more information, including links to resources that Josh and I chatted about today and how best to get in touch with him, head on over to our website, theboostpodcast.com, and check out our show notes from this episode and catch the Boost bonus. Josh, I want to thank you for sharing your journey with us today. And remember, anything is possible for you.
Now that you've completed this episode, the next step is to join the Boost Squad for strategic insights, tips, and tricks, as well as exclusive resources designed specifically to accelerate your personal and professional growth. All this and more is waiting for you at theboostpodcast.com.